Welcome to the 6th session of Local Foods College called Growing in Small Spaces. We have 2 presenters this evening, so we are going to get started right away so that we can give them both plenty of time. Our first presenter is Jason Bergstrand. He is a passionate gardener for the last 20 years. He leads the Lake Region Takes Root Community Garden in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And if you want to know more about Jason, he's posted a autobiographical video online that you can check out. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Jason Bergstrand.
All right, thank you, Noelle, for that great introduction, and I just looking forward to our time this evening. I'm going to be sharing quite a bit about 5 different alternatives to intensive growing methods. And really, most of those techniques I'm going to be drawing from a project that I have the ability to coordinate, and it's called Lake Region Takes Root. And Lake Region Takes Root was established in the summer of 2013, and it is a 1.5 acre parcel of land that is set aside for a community garden. But it's not your traditional community garden. It's where community volunteers spend their time growing produce collectively for families in need, where fresh fruits and vegetables are then donated to the Otter Tail County Women, Infants, and Children's Program, and currently 3 area food shelves. And so as we continue to expand the capacity of the garden, we'll be able to take on more organizations who desperately need this high quality food. So there's several missions to the Lake Region Takes Root Community Garden, which is to address food insecurity with quality food, to address community health and wellness, and also provide an opportunity for community education so folks can come and learn from this outdoor classroom, like I like to call it, and learn different techniques that they can employ in their own settings, whether it's at home or their own commercial growing business. They can learn valuable lessons. So in 2014, we served over 3,000 folks that were able to benefit from the community garden, and we grew just under 3 tons of food. So our goal is to grow 25,000 pounds of food annually, and we're well on our way to accomplishing that goal, but we have quite a ways to go. But we believe really that alternative and also intensive gardening methods are the way that is really going to help us reach our goal. And so we're going to be looking more closely at some of those things tonight. The garden is also about providing education about how to grow your own food and be self-reliant. It also serves as that outdoor classroom, as I mentioned earlier, to learn new techniques for growing that can then be uniquely applied to your own home situation. So we ask that master gardeners be a part of this process, extension educators, and just people who are passionate about gardening in particular. They provide a variety of educational experiences for our community. I'm also a beginner commercial produce grower myself through Melonhead Farm. I have a small melon farm that I grow with my son, my teenage son, and we sell directly to the Fresh Connect Food Hub in Fergus Falls. So I think I did a pretty good job there. I'll just take a step back just for a second. This is a picture of the community garden. It's located in Fergus Falls. It actually sits between 2 condominiums, so it's smack dab in the middle of a residential area. So we are doing our best to kind of marry agriculture and residential area together. And so with that, we want to make sure that we're good stewards of the property. We're bringing aesthetic, pleasing environment. We're using good methods of growing that everybody can benefit from and appreciate. So you'll see in this particular picture as well that we like to do wide rows, and we'll get into some of that in a moment. So tonight we're really going to be talking about 5 different areas to alternative and intensive growing methods, and really the benefits or why you'd even consider doing this type of growing methods is that They produce higher yields. They're prone to less disease and less pest issues. There's less weeds, which obviously equates to less labor, which I just totally love. There's reduce in risk of crop failure, and then also it maximizes resources, things like soil moisture and plant nutrients, reducing soil erosion, for example. So we'll jump into this a little bit more closely. Let's take a look at companion planting and what is meant by companion planting. The main purpose for companion planting is to create biodiversity, which is really defined as having many different plants and animals in a particular space or area. And in a natural biodiversity is a normal state of being of things. And therefore, in fields and in forests, there can be a large group of plants or animals that all kind of mix together and grow together, and they benefit from each other. So one important function of biodiversity is that pests have a harder time finding the plants that they really like, and therefore it seems to me that a logical way to confuse or ward off some of those pests is to create biodiversity in your garden by involving companion planting. And so companion planting also provides the ultimate benefits of intercropping, which is just slightly different. They have slightly different benefits, and we'll get into that in a few moments. But so companion planting, obviously it's great for biodiversity. It helps each other by providing shade or other benefits. So you may have one tall plant that is planted with a smaller plant that helps shade or protect it. It uses nutrients efficiently. It prevents pest problems and attracting beneficial insects. So on this particular slide, you see ladybug that's chomping down on some aphids, which is a wonderful thing. And then you have probably your most traditional example of companion planting, which is the Three Sisters system that our Native American population has done a wonderful job of sharing with us, and it's all about growing corn, beans, and squash. And so you have your corn in the middle. Typically, this is done on a little bit of a mound so that the corn is up on top, and then you've got the beans growing, which is a nitrogen fixer to the soil, which the corn takes a lot of nitrogen from the soil to grow. And so they aid there. The corn also then provides a trellis for the beans to grow on. And then the squash is added at the bottom of the hill there. And that covers the area up, and it provides like a living mulch. So it protects the soil from creating any more weeds to grow, but it also protects the soil and holds in the moisture. So the three working together is just a wonderful example of a great ecosystem. The one other thing to talk about in terms of the beneficial plants and insects is that even if you use organic pesticides to get rid of the bad bugs, you're also getting rid of the good bugs. So you got to be careful about that, and then that disrupts the balance of the ecosystem. So a solution to that might be to do more companion planting, for instance. So this is a slide that kind of talks a little bit about some of the beneficial flowers or plants, for that matter, and what they do. Typically, what these flowers and plants do is they bring in beneficial insects like parasitic wasps, bees, ladybugs, or hoverflies. And some of those examples there are borage, cosmos, dill, marigolds, sweet alyssum, and zinnias. And really, insects are the pulse of a garden, and they can be a measure of its future success. So if you don't have good pest control, your garden is going to be going to be attacked by different bugs, unfortunately, and there could be some less yield there. So it's important to bring in certain flowers that can attract those beneficial insects and ward off those the damaging insects. And of course, it also brings beauty into the garden. So that's just a great place to start. these are just a few particular flowers that I brought, as an example here. The other benefit of this is that they will, bring in those beneficials that then help pollinate your garden more too. So we all know that there's, a downturn in our bee population, and so it's just so critical that we, provide the environment that is welcoming them, as well as monarch butterflies are, on a downturn as well, and we want to be able to provide an environment that can help restore those natural insects. So for instance, French marigolds in particular produce a natural pesticide chemical from their root that confronts nematodes, and they ward off cucumber and squash bugs, for example. So that's just one example of how companion planting can help you in your garden. So this is a little bit of a table that I wanted to share just as a jumping off point. So for instance, if you had plant number 1 being your tomato, a good companion to tomato would be a cabbage. And then the tomato helps ward off the diamondback moth larvae that would, deposit on your cabbage and then create those little holes in your cabbage, for instance. Having nasturtiums planted along with cucumbers helps ward off cucumber beetles, for example, and then dwarf zinnias lure ladybugs. They love that particular flower, and that helps protect cauliflower. And so as you go down the list here, you'll see some of the benefits and then also the plants that could be grown together. Again, this is just a jumping off point. I did provide some other examples of some books and resources that I'm learning from myself. I in no way would consider myself an expert in this area. I'm learning just as everybody else is, and trying to implement these lessons learned into our situation. But I would really encourage you to take a look at those particular books and dive deeper into this particular subject matter. As mentioned before, be careful on those organic pesticides, because if you use those, they can get rid of the good bugs, and believe it or not, most bugs in the garden are good, okay? So we want to be able to take care of them. Okay, so we're going to, here's a couple of examples of how companion planting is done in the garden. Here you got marigolds with broccoli, and then you've got lettuce with broccoli. That's probably even a better example of intercropping, to be honest with you, as you have a larger plant with a smaller plant. But again, it's a great example of companion planting. Okay, so we're going to move on to intercropping. And intercropping is using multiple cropping practices involving growing 2 or more plant varieties in close proximity to each other. So the most common goal of intercropping is to produce, greater yields. And careful planning is what is required most, taking into account the soil, the climate, the crops that you're using, and its varieties. And it's critically important not to have crops competing with each other for physical space. So that's really something you want to consider. You don't want them competing for the nutrients, the water, and the sunlight. And some examples of intercropping strategies are planting a deep-rooted crop with a shallow-rooted crop. That's the best thing to be when you consider this particular method. So plant a tall crop with a shorter crop that requires some partial shade. So if you look on the right-hand side of this particular picture, what you don't see is the cucumber plant that is eventually going to start growing here on the trellis. And then at the base, you have a lettuce, and this actually comes from Bluebird Gardens in Mark Bone's greenhouse. And then on the left-hand side is onions and lettuce planted together. So you've got a rooted crop with a shallow, crop of lettuce, so they're not competing with the nutrients so much. If you have open spaces, weeds will definitely find it, and so intercropping can save you on some labor, and it's a great strategy to reduce weeding. obviously increasing yields, and it serves as a living mulch. So there again, getting more produce for the space and then reducing your work that's associated with it. There are a few different ways to practice intercropping, and one of them is called mixed intercropping, and that's where you use a different variety of plants, but they're all blended together. And then the second one is called row intercropping, and this is where you use separate rows of plants, but they're planted closely together. So if you remember the last picture where it showed the marigolds and the broccoli, they were side by side. That would be a good example of intercropping, or the row intercropping for that matter. And then temporal separation is growing a fast-growing crop, let's say a lettuce, with a slower growing crop, let's say a broccoli. So you have the broccoli that's going to take 60 to 80 days to grow, and your lettuce is going to take 40 to 45 to 50 days. So you can get a quick growing crop in there, and then as the broccoli grows, it can provide some shade, much needed shade for the lettuce, so that you might even be able to grow the lettuce deeper into the season and get multiple crops out of that as well. So succession planting is more about planting ahead than anything, and typically you plant the same variety of vegetable but on different dates, so that the harvest is not all at once, but rather a continuous harvest. And so this would definitely benefit you if you are, bringing produce to market, say to a farmer's market or to a food hub or any other particular outlet. If you planted all your crop at one time, it would all come due at one time as well, and then you might have difficulties at getting rid of that full amount of crops. So this is where you would do a couple different things. One would be to, instead of planting long rows of lettuce or greens, you plant, a certain section of them, maybe 25 feet, to start with, and then 10 or 14 days later, you stagger the harvest so that you plant, another section, and so you would have a generous supply of produce all throughout the summer. And then another way is just simply grow a crop and then harvest that, and then start over again, and then grow into the fall. So a good example of that might be start off with your radishes, and grow your radishes, and then once it gets hot, you obviously can't be growing radishes anymore, so you wait and you plant a fall crop to have radishes again in the fall when the weather starts to cool down. So your greens are a good example of that. They may not tolerate the heat as well, July and August, but of course spring and fall, they do a great job of growing. So that is succession planting. So another passion of mine is really square foot gardening. I kind of learned this technique more so for growing in my backyard, and it is such a wonderful method. The concept was developed by Mel Bartholomew, and many people have been doing kind of variations of square foot gardening for decades, but he kind of is the one who made it popular. And he's an engineer by background, and so he really studied this the last couple decades and figured out, how can we grow more intensively. And he came up with several different pieces that really made this all come together. And so raised beds is kind of where it's at. And you can have contained raised beds, as you see here in these pictures, out of, a wooden frame. And typically they are 4 feet wide. They can be any particular length, but the most common is just a 4x4. And the bottom right-hand side is a really good example as to why that works so well. Here you've got, the average adult who is planting, and there's a grid there that marks this all into 16 square feet. And then you're able to plant, a particular amount of seeds in each one of those square foot areas. But the basic premise as to why to keep it only 4 feet wide is that the average adult can reach in 2 feet from any side without then stepping onto the garden and compacting the soil. So we want, to reduce soil compaction, get better yields from that, obviously, and that's an important concept here. So this is a great photo of these ladies, planting this together. They're all reaching in 2 feet around and staying off the garden. And because of this, this method, you can, intensive way of growing, it reduces everything by 1/5 the space. So think about that you can grow twice as much produce on 1/5 the space, and why wouldn't you want to do that then? So this has really been, a revolutionary concept for me, and we've done this square foot garden technique even in a traditional row garden, and I'll show you that in a moment. So it equals less weeding and less watering. Use the grids to precision plant in the 1-foot square. It reduces seed waste. You grow vertically versus horizontally, and that's why you get more out of the small garden itself. And then for the ideal soil mixture, you don't have to do this, but the ideal soil mixture is 1/3 compost, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 vermiculite. And that combination is, holds in the moisture, holds in the nutrients, and just works the best. So some additional things with square foot gardening is that here's another example of the Three Sisters, example in a frame, so it's contained a little better. The middle picture shows the raised bed concept, and in this case we have 20-inch deep raised beds, so we grow some things in there that are a little bit deeper, like potatoes and sweet potatoes. The one in front of you in the middle there is actually kale, and there's 9 kale plants in there, and as you see, as they grow up, they just choke out any weeds. So there's just no opportunity for weed seeds to fall in there, and even if they did, they don't see the sunlight and they don't grow. So this is just one of those wonderful concepts where you plant, you water, as long as you have sunlight, things are going to turn out just beautifully. And on the right-hand side, you have sweet potatoes. And so that is a great way of doing sweet potatoes because, that's a deep south variety or plant. And so growing it up here, we have shorter summers, and we need to really keep the soil warmer quicker and longer, and the raised beds will allow you to do that. Square foot gardens as well can, like I mentioned earlier, can be at any length. I have 10-foot gardens as well as 16-foot gardens. It's just that width needs to stay at 4 feet. Raised beds can also be used with permanent structures like the wood frames, or mounted up using furrow equipment, and you'll see that very regularly. All right, and so what this square foot garden does here is that we actually used it in our traditional fields. We have 2 traditional fields now. We're going to break them up into 4 next year and just have one always in a cover crop situation, so that's always giving back to our soil. But here's an example of some of our Girl Scouts that are out in the garden, and we have 4-foot wide rows. And so even though they're not a raised bed, we still use the technique in terms of putting down the grid and our planting. So we still are able to intensify our planting by following Mel Bartholomew's method. And then we added wood mulch first to the aisles, and then we start to bring in the wood mulch into the beds themselves, and then that cuts down on the weeds, and it also breaks down over time and becomes a wonderful compost for the garden. And we're just really excited about where that's going to take us in the next few years. And then vertical gardening or vertical growing. Again, if we can grow things up rather than out, we're going to be in a far better situation. And so here are some great examples of vertical growing. We had a Girl Scout that did her Gold Star award, and she built some vertical beds for us in a very small area down below that needs the soil. So you can see in the middle picture here, she's planting cucumber seeds, and they're going to be growing up on this vertical trellis. And she's able to then maximize the space in very, very small area of soil, and we can get a lot of cucumbers from that area. Just behind her, you can see tomato plants. Again, we planted 9 tomato plants in those raised beds, so they got a nice deep soil to go into, and then as they grow up, they just literally choke out any weeds. So all we got to do is just water those and take in the harvest. On the far right is a tomato trellis. This system is kind of designed to take on the weight of those tomato plants. So there's a mechanism going across, a bar going across that helps support the tomatoes, and they tie the tomato plants to the top of the plant. And then as they grow, they just keep tightening that ribbon or twine and train it to grow up, is an example there. And then here's just a few more examples of ways that you can vertically grow. You can use hog panels with a T-post, for example, and do a weave technique where you just train the tomato plant to go in and out of the little square areas there. And you can train a plant to do just about anything as long as it has the proper support. Again, in the middle is a tomato trellis that's specifically designed to do something very similar to the previous picture. And then this is a picture of my square foot garden in my backyard where I use electrical conduit. So I build the trellis on the north side of the garden because your sun's casting from the south towards north. And so any of your vertical plants you want grown on the far north end of the garden. And here you can see it's a 6-foot trellis, and the tomato plants are growing up that, and then I just support it using the plastic ribbon. I kind of push in some of the branches into the trellis itself, and then just support it by the plastic ribbon on top. So there's many ways to be creative, and these are just a few examples. And then there's the basket weave. The basket weave is where you would have, T-post planted or positioned in between typically tomato plants. In this particular photo, it shows 2 plants for every T-post. We do about 4 tomato plants for every T-post. You'll just kind of have to experiment and see how it works for you. But basically, you just start on one end. You tie the twine at the bottom about 8 inches, and then you weave it in and out of the tomato plant, and then around the T-post, and then in and out of the tomato plant, around the T-post, and then you work your way back. So the first time, you just do it as the plant's about 8, 12 inches high. Give it some support. It grows another 8, inches. You give it some more support, and we do that about 3 times. Once you have the twine 3 or 4 times, the tomato plant it's got the support it needs to stay off the ground and upright. In the middle here is a great example of how a cucumber plant is trellising up the side of an apparatus where you have lettuce protected down below, casting a little bit of shade on that plant. So you're probably going to be able to get that a little bit more production out of that plant as it gets deeper into the growing season. It won't, quickly bolt with the hot weather because it'll have some shade there to protect it, and you'll be able to go a little bit further. The planter box on this right-hand side is another example of a particular trellis. So there's lots of ways of getting, creative here. And then lastly, I have just another few examples here of, just making sure that you're using proper supports, growing up, not out. In the middle system is the Derek Fell. He's written a great, book about growing vertically, and he, talks about his skyscraper trellis system, which is, one way of doing it is up against a wall. This is his garage, and he's got a system there. Very similar, to the right there is another trellis system for green beans. You could do a crop rotation on that really easy, where you go green beans one year, tomatoes another year. Cucumbers, some small melons even would grow there okay with the right support system. So there's lots of ways of intensifying your methods into your garden to get greater yields. It's important that you just go ahead and keep researching. I provided a number of resources for you to be able to do that. I hope this has been a nice little jumping off point for you to learn some more techniques. and be happy to take some questions as we transfer the ball over to Alex.
Okay, somebody asked about any quick internet resources for companion planting, and I sent one out already on the chat, and then we also have a few online. If you look under this session of Local Foods College in the Moodle site, you can find a few resources that Jason shared. Okay, there's a question, does putting wood mulch into your garden suck the nitrogen out from the soil?
Well, that can be a concern if you, put the wood chips down into the soil, like plow it under. You need to let them naturally break down from the top down. Yes, so the answer is yes if you plow it in or till it in when it's still in big, form. The idea would be to just lay it on top, and then as it naturally breaks down, it becomes one of the best mulches that you'll ever have.
Okay, and I got one more here. Did you find it hard to do the interplanting and square foot gardening when dealing with such a large area?
Yeah, you probably wouldn't want to square foot gardening in many ways is intercropping because the produce is so close together. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you intercrop within the actual 1 square foot area, but bring a multitude of crops into 1 square foot garden bed, if that makes sense. So that's kind of like one of the biggest benefits of square foot gardening is that you can just do such a variety of plants in 1 small area, and they all help each other out. So it gets kind of back to that biodiversity concept.
All right, there's one more quick question, and then we'll have to wait on any more. What kind of wood chips should be used?
I don't know if there's much of an issue with anything in particular as far as bad wood chips. My understanding is that even diseased trees, when they are chipped down, they don't cause a problem to garden situations. So to my knowledge, there isn't any particular tree product that shouldn't be used, but it's a great question, and I'd be happy to continue to research that one.
Great. Well, thanks again, Jason. Jason is going to stick around, and then we can do another round of questions after we hear from our next presenter. So if you have more for Jason, hang on to those. In the meantime, we will have Alex Liebman as our next presenter. He is an owner and partner of Stone's Throw Urban Farm, which is a 2.5-acre vegetable operation located on previously vacant lots throughout Minneapolis and St. Paul. I will go ahead and hand it right over to Alex.
Thanks, Noelle. And thank you, Jason, for all the great information. I have a piece of scrap paper kind of covered with notes, so thank you. Yeah, I own Stone's Throw Urban Farm, which is, as Noelle said, is an urban farm located in the Twin Cities. And we farm very intensively on about 2.5 acres of land. So we use a lot of intensive production strategies that I will talk about. We also use a fair amount of season extension, which I will get into. And then we also think a lot about how our production decisions that we're making impact the sort of profitability and business side of the farm. So for people that are interested in sort of the economics of small farming and sort of how to make those types of financial decisions, I'll sort of talk a little bit about that. Hopefully not too much for people that aren't interested in that sort of stuff. And just a quick sort of overview of the farm. We started in 2011, and our goal then has been to sort of figure out how urban farming can be a vegetable operation that depends on produce sales for its bottom line for its day-to-day operations, but that is also really both creating these beautiful sort of ecological havens or spaces inside of a big city, and also how we're really working with the neighbors that are surrounding the farm and the whole city to address these bigger issues around food access and food justice. So I'll sort of go heavy on the vegetable production side, but we're also think a lot about the sort of social and political context of the farm as well. So we can dive right in. I just need to figure out how to flip the pages. There we go. So a few guiding principles for just for our production in general has been creating the best conditions that are possible for healthy plants. And that is we really focused on building sort of soil building our sort of healthy plants from the bottom up and really focusing on soil health. The other big focus, and Jason highlighted this a lot, but is the timing, so that when we're doing these intensive techniques, especially when we're doing succession planting or intercropping, that we're taking notes, we're referencing other people's experiments, we're really dialing in on what's the proper timing, so things reach maturity, so we're harvesting when things are properly mature and not under or over mature, and also when we plant later into the fall, that we have things size up before it gets cold. I'll highlight a few pretty low-tech season extension techniques that we found have been just marvelous at allowing us to start planting and harvesting really in a week or two, and not harvesting in a week, but really start planting in the ground in a week or two, and harvesting all the way through the end of December, and sort of with little energy shortening up the non-vegetable eating season. And the last thing I'll just talk about is a bit about sort of financial decisions and sort of some strategies for growing for market. And yeah, feel free also to interrupt with a written question at a time, and I can take them as we go. So addressing some of these sort of like optimal conditions for plant success, we found that intensive production requires really high fertility soil. So we use a lot of compost. We probably don't use 150 yards of compost per acre per year, but we probably use 80 to 100. And in comparison, a lot of organic manuals or books that are really more focused on sort of less vegetable intensive and more sort of cover cropping and sort of other ways to sort of increase soil fertility, they might suggest 10 or 20 or 30 yards a year. So we're using a lot of compost in our system. And one thing that we've done in the city is we make a lot of our own compost using a mixture of wood chips, like Jason said is really good, but also using sort of some high nitrogen inputs like brewery waste or food waste. So we use a lot of compost. We also use some fish emulsion, especially for places where we have lower fertility or really heavy nitrogen feeders like tomatoes. And we're hoping to do some more worm castings, but that is also a great production technique. And then, and this is similar to some of the reasons behind these either raised beds or square foot gardening. It's really important that soil that drains well and isn't waterlogged, but also holds moisture. So one way to do this is just to create some raised beds, either through building them physically with wood boxes or just hilling up soil. So you have this sort of change in in bed structure and elevation in your field, so that when water hits it, it can run down off of the bed and drain away. And then also adding things like compost, increasing the organic matter of the soil is a really good way to hold on to water, so that you're not watering, every day to make sure that the plants have enough water. We do a lot of small seeded crops like spinach and carrots and different lettuces, and we have just found over and over again that the more we pay attention to the texture of the soil when we're planting, the more success we have. We have experimented with just turning in our crop residue from the previous crop and not trying to disturb the soil very much. There are a lot of good reasons to do that, biologically speaking. We found that especially for small seeded crops, it's really, really important to have a fine seed bed, and that there's a lot of attention that goes into just making sure that the seed and the soil make good contact. So we use a rake. People sell fancy rakes. We use a regular sort of thicker sort of garden rake to smooth out the clods and remove or bury rocks. We also invested in a pretty burly mower, so we mow the crop residue to shreds, and that interferes less with the soil preparation. Another option is to remove by hand the previous crop, compost it off-site, and then sort of reapply that compost when it's decomposed. And I think that, in sort of small vegetable farming and intensive production in general, tilling is a really tricky thing to overcome. Tilling is kind of destroying the soil structure, and in a lot of ways it's like having a wood stove that's burning well, and you have your sort of microbes and your fungus, and it's sort of going well, and the carbon is oxidizing, and suddenly with tilling you're like opening up the flue full bore, and you're just basically burning and burning and burning to get more your soil to heat up physically, or to have more available nitrogen, so your microbes are working kind of overtime. So we try to till as high up as possible when we're using a rototiller, and we also we've been trying out some strip till techniques in which we're not tilling the entire surface of the field. And a few other tricks are just focusing on accurate spacing. On a garden, you could use a yardstick, or this guy in this picture has built a pretty nifty row marker. So as he rolls, he's basically making an impression in the soil at a set distance. And then when you're either planting in that space or transplanting, it's really easy to come back and clear the weeds out of there, either by hoeing or by hand with these sort of defined lines. And if you're ever cultivating with machines and by tractor, this is a very standard practice. We've also found that just planting the correct amount of seed, either by hand or by using a seeder with the correct seed plate. Overcrowded crops are just as bad as not enough seed. Overcrowded crops we found don't size up, they require a little more thinning, and they're also more susceptible to disease if there's not enough airflow, if they're competing for resources. And then not enough seed, with spotty germination, will just lead to some weed control issues. And yeah, we do a fair amount of transplants. The transplants we use are like kale and tomatoes. We do some broccoli. We do a fair amount of onion transplants. and I won't get into sort of greenhouse techniques, but it's really important that you're putting sort of transplants that are healthy and are ready to go into the ground. And we've had years where we've had trouble in the greenhouse, and the sort of less well-prepared transplants have really set us back. I think this is my last sort of tip for the conditions. We really focus a lot on weed control. We do a lot of hoeing. We have some flame weeding techniques, and we're really focused on not letting the weeds. Well, definitely not letting the weeds set seed in the field in which they'll basically replant the next generation, reseed the next generation. We also find that it's really easy and almost enjoyable to weed when the weeds are like less than an inch. So we kind of talk about like we're weeding the soil, not weeding the crop. We are sort of, as weeds barely begin to emerge, we basically scuff them up with hose, and that creates also like a sort of dust mulch on the surface of the soil, which will further smother weeds. There's also a great Ann and Eric Nordell, I believe, in Beech Grove, Pennsylvania, or maybe that's the name of their farm, Beech Grove Farm. The Nordells, if you search for them on the internet, have some really great philosophies about sort of reorienting weed management to think about how to sort of use farming techniques that, and especially cover cropping techniques that address weeds from sort of the soil perspective and not looking at sort of they're just them competing with the cash crop, and sort of designing farms around how to lessen weed pressure. So that's a really they're a good resource. So I'll just talk quickly about timing. We mainly do, in terms of intensive techniques, we mainly do succession planting. And we'll plant up to 4 crops per season in the same space. And this is like a really key component of how our farm functions on small amounts of land inside of a city. So, and just sort of penciling some numbers, like if each crop provides, say, $20,000 an acre of gross income, and we can grow 3 crops in that space, we can suddenly make $60,000 an acre in gross profit. So we're really focused on sort of these kind of quick successions in which we're planting back to back on the same space. And I think the next slide just demonstrates some of some examples of successions that we used. So, for example, in say a warmish spring, unlike the ones we've had the last 2 years, but ones that we often have, we'll plant some salad or lettuce mix from seed on April 10th, and we'll cover that with some fabric row cover, like some Rime, which I will show in the next season extension technique, which I'll get to. And then 30 days later, a little bit less, we are harvesting that. And then we'll say mow that salad mix, and we'll let it decompose for a few days. We'll add some compost, and then we'll immediately plant radishes right into the same bed. And that's another 30-day crop. And then, you know, a day or two after we're done pulling the radishes, or even that afternoon when the bed is cleared, we'll plant beets. And 65 days later, when we're done harvesting beets, we'll plant a fall spinach crop. So this kind of gets back to some of those, like, if the better our soil is, the more accurately we've planted in terms of the amount of seed we've put out, so that things size up evenly. The better we've kept weeds under control, the better this system works. So it's really dependent on the sort of clockwork-like function to be able to get 3 or 4 crops in a given space. Another succession we'll use, and this sort of combines intercropping and succession planting, but we will plant like head lettuce early in the spring, and we'll put those transplants in the outside of the bed. And then we'll plant tomatoes down the center about a month later as the lettuce transplants begin to size up. We'll harvest those lettuces, allowing tomatoes the space to grow. We'll trellis them, but then early July, as the tomatoes begin to get big, we'll sort of cover the ground with a bunch of clover and oats for a cover crop, and usually before a big rainstorm. And that allows us to get 2 crops in 1 year and also get a nice cover crop, which is great for the soil. So I can't stress enough just how important sort of taking notes on the timing, referencing your seed packets so you know exactly how long things should take to size up, and then referencing that back to what actually happens. And then you can basically just kind of hone in your succession planting system to sort of work as well as possible. So season extension, we use a lot of season extension methods on the farm, and basically there's just kind of low energy methods to extend the growing season early in the spring or later into the fall. And one thing I would stress is it can be really enticing to think about producing year-round, or to have spinach in December. And from a farming perspective, I would say make sure you're really analyzing if the additional investment in hoop house structures or heating systems in your greenhouses are increasing your revenues. Like, is the extra spinach you're harvesting going to cover those costs? And also, what are your labor expenditures? And what do you want to be personally doing? Like, if you're really, really farming intensively from April to October during the summer months, it's okay to take a rest and not like try to extend the season for another 3 months. Or does sort of winter production allow you to sort of balance out the farming season? So instead of this intense summer rush, you have this sort of more balanced farming season over 8 or 9 months. So I always like to, just in terms of the farming perspective, that it can be really exciting to sort of put all this investment in and focus on farming year-round. And I think that's amazing and needed and great, but it's also important to think about what is sort of your personal farm need, or what do you personally need at different times of the year, because rest is important as well. But so Rime, as I mentioned earlier, is basically a fabric row cover. It's available in varying thicknesses, and it basically gets laid down either over small hoops or just directly on top of the crop. And it increases temperatures anywhere from like 2 to 4 degrees, which can actually be quite a lot on like a 28-degree night, to prevent crops from freezing. And it's also really good for insect control during the growing season. We use it a lot for flea beetles on things like Napa cabbage. And I have pictures of these in the next slides. Another technique is using these sort of low hoops. That's basically to create like a very miniature greenhouse. They're also called like caterpillar tunnels. They're usually used out of bent like 10-foot, 1/2 inch like PVC or metal conduit, basically either just buried in the soil or attached to pieces of rebar that are pounded into the ground. And those can be covered with Rime or greenhouse plastic. And then high tunnels are basically unheated greenhouse-style structures. They come in all sorts of varieties of sizes and models. You can buy them with all sorts of bells and whistles. I recommend trolling Craigslist for really high-quality, cheap, used high tunnels. And these are great for either heat-loving crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers that just really thrive off of a little bit drier conditions and the extra heat in our climate, and they're also great for expanding winter production. And just a note, and I won't get into details, but it's really important that you focus on the soil health, as this really intensive growing indoors especially can really deplete the soil. And also be careful of salt buildup, especially if you're using like groundwater, like a well. Over time, you can get problems with salt buildup that can basically create really basic conditions for your soil. So you want to make sure you're addressing some of those issues. So just an example from our farm, there's some early spring tomatoes in the left, upper left, and you can actually see some of the green stuff in the furrows to the right is salad mix that we had just taken out. And this is probably like May 10th or May 15th. So we've already had a great crop of salad mix we've harvested for maybe a month that was planted in early March, and now we're planting tomatoes. And then this will go on to be mulched. And we just started growing ginger last year, which has been a really great fall crop for us. And so you can see that inside the high tunnels on the basically bordering, you have ginger growing on the inside. But then we've also experimented with basically we have this nice microclimate in between the high tunnels, where in a hot day, warm air is radiating out of them. There's less intense wind. So we've experimented with growing heat-loving crops in this space as well if you're tight on high tunnel space. So just for visual, here's some upper left is some row cover inside fields. To the right are these low hoops. To the bottom left are some tomatoes growing inside of a high tunnel. And then on the bottom right might be a typical like kind of deep winter production where you're sort of doubling up sort of extension techniques. So we're inside of a high tunnel, you have some row cover, and that's just adding some additional temperature protection. And I got a question here that the question is that there's some crops that are too delicate to cover directly with remay. And I think it's a great question. I think there are, especially things like head lettuce, where like the quality of the leaf matters a lot. You can get some issues either like when it's really cold, if some frost basically hits the remay and kind of affixes the lettuce to the remay. You can get some sort of burn. And also, like in the spring, if it gets too hot, you can have some burning issues with some delicate crops. So I would say things like if you're remaying carrots because it's the middle of the winter and you just want to make sure they're a little bit warmer, I don't think it matters. I think for things like spinaches or salad mix or arugula or lettuce heads, I think it can't hurt to just use some simple hoops. And we just use like wire wickets that span the width of our bed. And that's been really a nice way to create that space between the remay and the crop. And that's basically what they're doing in this bottom right picture. So a few tips that we found to be really useful. If you're planting into the fall, it's really important that you sort of conceptually understand that how reduced day length and cold temperatures are going to delay your crop growth. So when you get a seed packet that says that your salad mix is going to be mature in 30 days, that's like mid-May or July, like perfect growing conditions. And the deeper you get into late August, September, October, the less daylight there is, the cooler it is, and the more time you need to basically budget for that crop to reach maturity. So, for example, spinach might be like a 40 day crop under normal conditions. if you plant that same crop on September 15th, it's not going to be harvestable for maybe 60 to 70 days, like the middle of December. So, and actually, I have a reference in the back, but Elliot Coleman has this amazing book called Winter Harvest Handbook, and he basically kind of tracked some crops and created some sort of days to harvest charts based on when they were planted. And there's this sort of huge difference between sort of end of July and end of August in terms of planting date, when it's really important, if you're sort of planning to have these sort of hardy crops late into the fall, that you make sure you allow enough time for them to mature when planting. So we've found that these like key fall planting times are often when you're really busy doing other things during the middle of summer. So like late July, the first week of August, this is when we're really, really focused on getting like our December carrots into the ground or our November spinach into the ground. So it's important that you just keep well organized. So if you're doing other things like harvesting tomatoes or working at the farmer's market, that you know that you're also prepping for this winter harvest. And then I would also think about cold temperatures as a refrigerator, especially inside of a high tunnel. So things will really slow down in terms of how well they're growing in the fall, but they can hang out for a long time. So we had really good success planting carrots that are like full maturity on October 15th, and have just sort of hung out in the ground for 2 months after that and gotten sweeter and sweeter and grown slowly, but we haven't like depended on them to grow during those cold months of the year. We basically just treated the ground as a refrigerator. So I'd say a good few crops to try would be spinach, carrots, kale can work really well inside of a high tunnel or under low hoops, and sorrel is a really interesting kind of citrusy, very hardy salad green, which we've had a lot of success with growing in the winter. Irrigate, especially when things are germinating, and make sure that you're ventilating the low hoops and the high tunnels to prevent any pathogens or overheating on sunny days. And we also just think about prioritizing our structural, like high tunnel space for the most profitable crops, and then using things like low tunnels or remay or plastic covering hoops or whatever is sort of less of a infrastructure investment for the hardy crops like spinach or parsnips or carrots. I just have a few more things to go over, and it's just about growing for market. Some of our strategies. I think intensive production can be a really good method for increasing the profitability of your farm operation, but it's not a silver bullet. Like, it takes a lot of labor, and I would just take the time to understand the economic nuances of what you're doing and now what your equipment is set up for, and we just try to definitely include labor in all of our sort of analysis of financial analyses of what we're growing, and then just asking yourself, what do the customers want? Are there niches that you can fill in your local market? Is there demand in certain grocery stores or restaurants? Also, what are you good at growing? What do you experience growing? Is there something you particularly want to grow? And then how do the crops that you're growing or plan to grow fit in with your existing operation and farm? And then I would just say there's tons of good resources out there. People have been farming for a very long time. And I sometimes will read crop manuals from the 1870s and realize that, people's conceptions of what was possible in terms of vegetable production was well more evolved, 140 years ago than my own approach now. So, and there's a particular book, and I have at the end that I'd recommend taking a look at. And then I would just say, if you're putting a ton of work in, if you're marketing your produce, market nicely and clean it. Create beautiful displays that reflect all this effort. For our wholesale accounts, we check in with them regularly. We deliver, or do our best to deliver on time and in full every single time. And I think that's just, you owe it to yourself if you're putting all of this hard effort into farming to sort of do this last small step. And so this is an example of like our market stand. Sometimes we do some signage that we hope attracts people. And then I worked for a farmer who'd always talk about the market PhD, which was pile high and deep, and just sort of creating this this feeling of abundance when people walk into your farm stand. So I think that's it. These are some resources that I have that I swear by, that I've thumbed through endless times in the last several years since we started this project, and that when I was interning on farms. And the book from the 1870s, I believe, is this second book here, Peter Henderson, Gardening for Profit. And the link here is actually, I think you can get a free PDF online. And that, he was a market gardener in, I think, New Jersey, but I think it's maybe the outskirts of New York City. It was growing just amazing produce. And the online sources are things that other slides. John Beerbaum is just a great horticultural researcher at Michigan State. He's put out a lot of really good small farming manuals. And then I also put down my phone number and email down here if you have questions, or if you want me to share sort of our own crop planning documents or other types of things that we've used. And I'll be busy the next while, but I will get back to you eventually. And lastly, I had the chance to go to Cuba for a few weeks to study some of their intensive food production practices. I just have a few pictures here at the end. And this is a urban farm located in the middle of some high rises. So you can see they have these sort of square foot gardening, these kind of raised beds. They use old corrugated roof tile, and then just really bountiful crops. And there's all sorts of intercropping. Like Jason was saying, they have marigolds and other flowers. At the hedgerows, they also use corn to attract insects. And then if you look on the bottom right, especially, you can see them. They're these they look like little signs inside the growing beds. And those are actually pieces of paper or cardboard that have something sticky painted on them, and they're usually yellow or red, and they basically attract insects and basically cause the insects to get pegged to them. So it's just sort of a really low-tech insect trap. These are just some guys who on the right are showing off their bed marking tools. They drag it to the beds. They have a set width between crops. And the guy on the left, I really love. They're planting a mango orchard, but they're growing beans in between. So before the mango trees come into full production, you can see the dots of mango trees in the top left. They're also growing beans for human consumption. And I think one last one is this is just another example of just a pretty active, intensive food production space. And you can see, I think there's dill on the outside of some cabbage rows, lettuce that's being replanted, and people are applying compost and fertilizers. So it's it's a worldwide movement. So yeah, I hope I could answer some questions or give some information you didn't already have, and thanks for attending.
Wow, thanks, Alex. That was really great. I love seeing those pictures of Cuba, especially. So if anybody has questions, please send those You can send them in the chat box to everyone or directly to myself or either of the presenters. You can also simply unmute yourself if you'd like to do it that way. Well, I have a question for Jason. I'm wondering, what are some of the techniques that you'll try and integrate as you try and get up to 25,000 pounds?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, we will continue to do the square foot garden technique. I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but we currently grow on about a third of the property. And so we're a few years out yet from, reaching our capacity. So we need to continue to work on the infrastructure of our garden. But part of what we'll do is, if you remember those vertical raised bed apparatuses that Derek Fell had, I didn't have the greatest picture there, but one of them, what he does is it's basically 4 feet wide, and then he's got crops growing down below it in a square foot garden technique, and then in the middle of that garden, he's got a trellis where he's growing green beans or tomatoes up in the middle of the garden. So we'll probably be integrating a number of those down a particular row or rows, and then we'll be able to rotate those crops from year to year to make sure that we take good care of our soil. But there'll be many more vertical growing apparatuses is probably the best thing that I can tell you in terms of getting things up and rather than out and growing more that way.
All right, great, thank you. A couple questions have come in. One is about how do you get the volume of compost that you require?
Should I take a stab?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Alex.
We basically, so some of this, I feel like it's kind of, some of it's a science and some of it's an art or sort of what's happening on the farm that specific day. But we take soil tests and try to match some of our nitrogen needs to what we think we can get from the compost. And there are some good ways at sort of estimating how much nitrogen will be available to the crop in a given year in compost, and then we sort of estimate how much we need. That can be, that's sort of the short answer. It's also compost provides nitrogen and other nutrients, phosphorus, for a long period of time. So we also use things like other types of fertilizers like chicken manure or fish emulsion to sort of satisfy some of the nutrient demands of our crop in the short term. In terms of making compost, we estimate that we get about 2/3 to 3/4 back in finished compost from what we put in. So we measure the amount of raw product and sort of estimate from there. I also reference just a lot of what other growers are doing and sort of the rates that they're using, and tailor that to our own, our own scenario. And yeah.
One thing I could add is at Lake Region Takes Root, we're going to be composting like coffee grounds from the hospital cafeteria and then raw produce that they have there. We will be composting that down and then adding that into our garden. So there's some creative ways of maybe partnering with some local businesses. We have a new brewery that's opening in Fergus Falls, so I wrote that one down, Alex, when you mentioned brewery waste. That could be a potential opportunity for us.
Yeah, I can't speak more highly of brewery waste. It's really high in nitrogen. It doesn't smell very bad. It's really easy to control the smell, especially with some wood chips. And it's moist, which is really nice for making compost, but not sopping wet. And it's also, because it's such small grain, it has really high surface area. So it's really like a great place for microbes to just kind of thrive. So I wish you, Jason, and anybody else luck in acquiring that wonderful product.
We have another question, or a couple of them related to compost. First of all, how long does it take to make it? And second, where do you get fish emulsion?
So our compost, this is probably a long question, but there's some, what we do, because we're in the city especially, and we don't want to basically overpower our neighbors or city council members with smell, and because don't have a ton of time, is we make really big static piles where we just are piling layers of nitrogen-rich material like the brewery waste and carbon-rich material like leaf waste or wood chips, piling those on in like alternating 4 or 8-inch piles, and we're just letting that sit there for like 8 months to a year. And by then, it's basically called kind of like anaerobic composting. We're not adding a lot of oxygen, which is basically primes your pump just like a gasoline engine. We're not adding that to the system by turning it a lot, but we are basically just letting the pile sit there and slowly break down. So that takes a long time, but once it's set up, it doesn't require much maintenance. Alternatively, you can flip your pile either through like rolling, like tumbling backyard compost bins, or by turning it with a tractor and make compost in as little as like a few weeks. So that's really a sort of management and logistical approach, I suppose. And yeah, and then it's going to depend too on what sort of things you're putting into it. Like if you're putting in tree branches, that's going to take a very much longer time than putting in, say, wood chips or leaves. And I just say make sure that, especially like on a backyard scale, that you really need at least a like 5 by 5 by 5 or 4 by 4 by 4 pile feet, 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet, to basically have enough biomass so it gets hot enough to actually break down. And I just buy my fish emulsion from maybe Jordan's in Woodbury, but any like agricultural supply, I guess any like garden store would definitely have some, and probably will by now has organic options as well. So.
Great, thanks. Switching gears, there's a question about protecting from both 2- and 4-legged pests. Any recommendations there?
Well, the ultimate protection would be to have a deer fence around your property. Certainly not the least expensive for sure, but you know, if you're going to keep pests out, that's the ultimate way to go.
Yeah, I agree. We've actually even in the city we've had a lot of trouble with deer on a specific spot. And we've tried all sorts of things. I think a deer fence is a good investment. I mean, there are some really good NRCS cost share programs, and I think that anybody can apply. I just think you have to document the fact that these pests are destroying your crop. Simple like vole or mouse traps could help. Yeah, I think in terms of bigger animals, it's kind of I think physical barriers are probably the best bet.
We also put like a PVC pipe frame over the top of some of our square foot gardens.
Mm-hmm.
Deer really love the sweet potatoes, for instance. They like to come in there and jump on those leaves. So we've built some PVC pipe frames that we just place over the top of those raised beds, and then just put some of that bird netting down. That keeps them out then. So, you got to get creative. On my commercial property, I put electric fence around. If you do it early in the spring, the deer are likely to come up and rub into it first before jumping it, and if they do, then it'll scare them off. But if they're wise, they will hop it. But typically they're more curious, and they'll come up and bump into it first. So there's a variety of things that you can do. There's some other products that you can spray on your plants that potentially can rid deer and some other pests from getting into your garden. I've had various degrees of success with that, so I don't have a tried and true remedy other than the deer fence itself. Fish line sometimes is put on around the garden. Again, the deer don't have very good eyesight, and so they'll bump into that, especially at night when they're out trying to comb for something to eat. They certainly will not see it, and they'll bump into it, get scared, and run off. So just keep reading, I guess, would be the best thing. There's so many different options out there, and try different things to see if it might work for you.
Great. Well, speaking of continuing to read, someone wants to know if there's a book or other resource to help identify nutrition deficiencies in plants visually.
Good question. I want to say that there's a great one that came out of a Canadian Agricultural Society. I could look it up. I forget the title. What I do is I spend a lot of summer evenings at night when I get home looking up crop diseases on the internet. And I know I'm a youthful gent, so I think especially even like the U of M extension pages have been great. There are other, and those can be and lots of different university extension programs that put out different soil deficiency or insect pest or fungal disease identification keys. So then you can really compare. You can say, well, this is the Minnesota soil deficiency pictures for boron, and the Wisconsin ones look like this, and so that's what I do. If you want a book, I think I can conjure up the title somewhere, but not off the top of my head. I don't know a great one.
Well, thanks for that plug for extension.
Oh, I didn't realize I was doing that. Yeah.
Well, I have not seen any more questions come through. Okay, let's see. Here's one. That always happens as soon as I say that. Especially in the urban area with your neighbors, have you thought of doing kitchen scrap composting or collecting?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We have, yes, the neighbors right around. We sort of have a bunch of different plots, but we have some plots that are more like our kind of home base plots where we spend more time. And around there, yeah, we've tried to encourage our neighbors to dump in the compost piles. It's worked pretty well. We've also, for a while, we were giving 5-gallon buckets to CSA members and then washing them out letting them dump their compost, their kitchen scraps in our compost, then washing them out while they picked up our CSA boxes. That didn't, people weren't really into that. So I think, yeah, I'd love to, every year I try to do more of that. At this point, we just use so much compost and need so much fertility that we've gone to some, I wouldn't say really industrial, but like kind of microbrewery scale where they're filling up a bunch of, big 55-gallon buckets of brewery waste a week so that we have this kind of constant source. But I think like on a backyard scale, if you could get a few neighbors just to dump their food waste in your compost bin, you probably have enough for your whole garden plus some, especially if you're adding some leaves or really really composting. So I think that diverting those waste streams is key, is great.
So there were two comments related to that. Earlier, somebody mentioned that oak leaves are great for composting. And then someone also just mentioned that they have attracted skunks when composting kitchen scraps. So do either of you guys have any tips for rodent control or mammal control, I guess, related to the compost pile?
Well, the first thing is to make sure that you're not dumping in, like meats or things that would attract, those skunks, because typically they wouldn't go into the compost without having some other source that would draw them. But if that is indeed not the case, maybe put in some screens over the top, to hold it down, and that would probably keep them from getting in. Make it out of a wider apparatus, or a pallet. There's lots of different ways of building a compost bin.
Yeah, in terms of like backyard or even like especially like pallet compost bins, you can just line them with a little bit of hardware cloth or chicken wire. It's good. I agree. Like, I think the better that the compost system's working, the less it smells putrid, the less issues you're going to have. So I would say like our number one rule for composting is, so you have like your carbon sources which are high in carbon, and I would look at those, like especially in urban areas, like your like smell capturing elements. So your wood chips, your leaves, and then I would look at like your nitrogen, like your food waste, your brewery waste, etc. We always talk about, we always want to have our carbon on hand. Like we never want to like take in another brewery account if we don't have another good source of wood chips. But even on a backyard scale, you don't want to just add a bunch of kitchen waste without layering on leaves or some wood chips or some grass clippings, just something to kind of damper the smell so you don't get this sort of putrid, festing kind of pile of rotting vegetables, but you're creating the conditions for composting to happen. So I think that's an important one, that it's a biological system that kind of needs to be managed. You don't need to manage it much, but you need to have some focus on that.
Right. If it's managed well, then it shouldn't smell as bad.
Great. Those are great compost management tips right there. I am not seeing any more questions. Okay, here we go. Do eggshells count as meat in your compost pile?
I say no, but maybe Jason says differently.
Nope, I would agree. No, they're a great source of composting, good source of calcium.
All right. Okay, one more question. In the urban area, do you hill your beds or is there a structure?
Yeah, good. So we currently have do most things with a two-wheeled tractor. It's called a BCS. It's a Italian machine, but there are plenty of people selling them in the U.S. And we basically hill our beds using like a walk-behind tractor. I am really inspired by this sort of basically seeing in Cuba this kind of basically what is like square foot gardening techniques, these sort of intensive raised beds on a really large scale, like acres and acres. So I'm trying to think about what kind of supplies we could use that are cheap, how to do it without like spending all of our labor for the next few years just building beds. So I'd like to move in the direction of having sort of physically permanent raised beds. As of now, on our scale, we basically mechanically hill our beds and then try to keep those same areas the same every year, so we're not walking on top of the bed. So the areas we're walking and the areas we're driving are the same each year, so we lessen the soil compaction.
All right, let's see. Okay, I think we have gone past 7:30 and come to the end of our questions. I just want to thank both of the presenters so much, Jason and Alex. This was incredibly informative, and I, for one, got a ton of ideas, and I'm excited to start planning out my garden for this next season. So thank you both so much. And